hard to stand back here at the Genesis Communication Network, coming to you from the hills overlooking beautiful and picturesque Monterey Bay, and bringing you the news behind the news, the story behind the story, hoping to convince you that reality is usually scoffed at, that illusion is usually king. But in the battle for survival of Western civilization, it's got to be reality, not illusion or delusion, that will determine what the future will bring. And I need to remind you the views that are expressed here are not necessarily those of the owners, management, staff, sponsors, or supporters of the station you're listening to. They happen to be my views, and, well, for the next short period of time, the next hour, they're going to be the views of Dr. Bowman, Lieutenant Colonel Bowman, fighter pilot, retired now, but he's going around the country trying to get people to understand what really happened on September 11th, 2001. Now, if the American people understood that there is an invisible government, not the government that you and I know, respect, love, but there's an invisible government that controls this country that somehow, in some way, was responsible for what happened. I'm not saying who it was, but certainly we have not been told the truth about what happened that day, that tragic day when almost 3,000 Americans died. And certainly there's a serious question as to who was responsible, what really happened, but I can tell you one thing for certain. Building 7 was controlled demolition, and all of the evidence is that the Twin Towers came down not because they were struck by planes, not because there were fires in the building, but from controlled demolition as well. And with that as a background, thank you so very much for being with us today, Colonel.
Well, thank you, Stan.
Why don't you pick up the story and tell us now? You have been around. You've made these tours of the country before. You're coming around again. Do you think that the American people are beginning to understand that we've been lied to, that the murderers are still on the loose here in America?
Well, I think more and more Americans are becoming convinced of that. It's slow going because the major controlled corporate monopoly media will not cooperate whatsoever in getting the American people the truth. You'd think with the biggest crime of the century and all sorts of contradictions and unanswered questions that investigative reporters would be all over this. Where is the kind of thing that gave us Watergate and all the rest of it when you need it? But we're gradually making progress and convincing one person after another that they have been massively lied to. And what happened on September 11th, 2001 was not only the death of roughly 3,000 people, but the start of a campaign of terror, which we're suffering under to this day, including unnecessary, illegal, unconstitutional wars of aggression against Afghanistan and Iraq, the loss one after another of the rights that we've been guaranteed in the Constitution and Bill of Rights, the stealing of vast amounts of the wealth that the American people create, one evil after another, all because of 9/11. And so, there are some people that say, maybe we were lied to about 9/11, but that's ancient history. What does it matter now? And the truth is, it matters enormously because until the government myth, the official conspiracy theory about 9/11 is exposed and some real truth told through a new independent investigation, all these evils are going to continue no matter which party is in power.
Well, certainly you would think that Congress would would insist on an independent evaluation, but I don't think anybody in Congress has the courage to do that because, of course, if they did, why they would come after them, the invisible government would go after them and do everything they could to demonize, and certainly now that the federal government can investigate anybody, they can plant people in government offices as they did with the governor of Illinois. I don't necessarily I think he's a good guy, but certainly they just had telephone taps. They had taps in the office so they could listen to every conversation. They could go after anybody in America who dared to bring out the truth, because this is one of the greatest crimes, as you said. The murderers are still on the loose, and basically they should be brought to justice. So certainly I admire you, and I really respect the fact that you haven't got discouraged. You just keep plugging along there. Is there anything new as far as the information on what happened that day? Has anybody come forward? We know a lot of people have come forward in one way or another, and some of them have actually disappeared. We know that, Jimmy Walters is living in hiding in Europe, and Michael Rupert is living in hiding in Canada for bringing out what really happened that day. And Sergeant Laura Chavez, I interviewed. He's never been heard from since he did an interview with me. Is there anything new that you have on this?
Well, what is really new, and you're right, there have been people that have come forward and are studiously ignored by the corporate mainstream media. But the important thing that has happened in the last couple of years is that the Obama administration is not only ignoring the call for a new administration and ignoring our desire for truth, but is actually continuing and even increasing the evils that are caused by 9/11. When President Obama is asked why he is expanding the war against Afghanistan and extending it into Pakistan, he says, well, those are the people who attacked us on 9/11. When he is asked why he has not called for the repeal of the Patriot Act and the Military Commissions Act, why he has not canceled Presidential Directives 20 and 51, which give him dictatorial powers, why he has not done away with the threat of martial law, why he has not exposed and closed the concentration camps around the country built by Halliburton. The answer is the same, 9/11. And that's why exposing the truth is so very important.
In fact, I think it was so funny, when Steve Croft on 60 Minutes asked President Obama why he was adding 30,000 more troops to the forces already in Afghanistan when there were only 100 members of Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, at least according to General James Jones, the National Security Advisor. President Obama justified sending an additional 30,000 troops to Afghanistan, saying, I'm trying to protect the American people against Al-Qaeda. Well, my goodness, why not send in a couple of units of special forces and, maybe 3 or 4 units, and man on man, they could wipe out Al-Qaeda probably overnight. They're very efficient, but they don't do that. And the American people really don't seem to see there's anything wrong with sending an additional 30,000 troops, gives us almost 90,000 troops there, plus 100,000 private contractors that we hire, almost 200,000 men because they're 100 members of Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. Actually, some people say there are only 50 members of Al-Qaeda, but that's why we've got to have our troops there, because they threaten the United States. Sometimes you wonder if the American people are gullible. Other times I'm sure they're gullible, and I think what you're doing is so vitally important, Colonel, getting around, and I know it's a great personal sacrifice for you to go on these tours. I know how exhausting they are because I've done the same thing in my younger years. But basically, you're having an opportunity. Where are you speaking now here in California?
Well, I'll be speaking tomorrow night in Richmond, and Then I'll be speaking in Santa Cruz, then Berkeley, and then Fresno and Leadley and Bakersfield.
Hold that thought. We'll get back to that in just a moment here. Well, Dr. Stan back here at the Genesis Communication Network. Our guest is Dr. Bob Bowman, and we're talking about what happened on September 11, 2001, when almost 3,000 Americans were murdered, and their murderers are still on the loose in America, and this was not done by a group of radical Islamists. How do we know that? Well, number one, we know that Building 7 was a controlled demolition. If you doubt it, go to my website, radioliberty.com, and you can actually go to the section on videos on the web, go to the bottom of the page, and you can watch Building 7 come down and notice how the center of the roof collapses first. That is pathognomonic of a controlled demolition. Then they take out the base of the building, and then the building comes down in its own shadow. And then, of course, at Shanksville, why they tell us the plane dived into the ground, but there just wasn't any wreckage there. The wreckage was over the radius of 8 miles, something like that. And certainly the attack on the Pentagon, there's just a little tiny hole there initially until the rest of the building collapsed. There's no way that a major airline could have gone into that little hole, especially with its wings and its engines and its tail. Colonel, when you talk to people, do they really think about these inconsistencies?
Well, yes. We have a way of doing that. First, when I am going to Congress and whatnot, you can't get them to sit down for 2 hours and watch loose change or something. So I created a 3-minute video, which I call my smoking gun video, which is all about Building 7. And it opens by showing the BBC announcing the collapse of Building 7 before it happened, and then shows the owner of the building, Larry Silverstein, announcing his decision to pull it, and finally about a dozen views of the building coming down, as you say, in an obvious controlled demolition of an intact building with no visible fires. So if that doesn't make somebody say, something is fishy, then I don't know how to reach them.
Well, I think, it's just the thing. I remember it took me a year or two before I was really willing to admit that this was a controlled demolition of the Twin Towers. And the thing that convinced me, as you say, was Building 7. And if Building 7 was a controlled demolition, then everything is fraudulent. And the American people have to understand the murderers are still on the loose. So as you show that DVD at all your presentations, and then what are the other major points as far as you're concerned that Cindy would try to convince people that we've been lied to by the media, we've been lied to by the presidents, both President Bush and President Obama, and of course that the people responsible have never been brought to justice?
Well, in the first place, hijacked airliners do not fly around for an hour and 40 minutes without being intercepted, unless our air defense system was deliberately sabotaged. And 19 Arabs with box cutters and an old man on a dialysis machine in a cave in Afghanistan could not have paralyzed our air defense system.